What if the person who held the key to dozens of unsolved murders stayed silent for decades, only for the truth to emerge after his voice was gone? What if the answers detectives had chased for years didn't come from a courtroom, a witness, or new forensic technology, but from confessions that were only fully understood once the killer was dead? Tonight's story is not about a ghost, a myth, or a supernatural event. It's about something far more unsettling, a man who carried secrets to his grave, and how those secrets came back to solve cold cases long after most people had stopped looking. This is the true story of how one of the most prolific serial killers in American history helped close dozens of cold cases after the world had already begun to forget the victims. For decades, law enforcement agencies across the United States were haunted by the same question. Why were so many women, often poor, marginalized, and living transient lives, disappearing without answers? In city after city, cases went cold. Files gathered dust. Families were left with nothing but uncertainty and grief. The crimes didn't look connected, and in many instances, the victims were barely identified, let alone avenged. What no one knew was that a single man was responsible for many of these deaths, and that he would only begin telling the truth near the end of his life. That man was Samuel Little. Born in 1940, Little lived much of his early life drifting from place to place. He had a long criminal record, including assault, drug offenses, and theft, but for years he remained under the radar when it came to homicide. His victims were primarily women he believed no one would miss, sex workers, drug users, and unhoused individuals. This grim calculation allowed him to evade detection for decades. By the time Little was finally arrested in 2012, it wasn't for murder at all. It was for drug-related charges in Kentucky. Only later, through DNA evidence, would authorities connect him to the 1987 murders of 3 women in Los Angeles. In 2014, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For most killers, that would have been the end of the story. But for Samuel Little, it was only the beginning. Behind prison walls, Little began to talk. At first, investigators were skeptical. Serial killers sometimes exaggerate their crimes for attention or control. Confessions without evidence are often unreliable. But Little's statements were different. He didn't just claim responsibility, he described murders in chilling detail: locations, positions, weather conditions, the way the victims looked, things only the killer or investigators would know. Still, even then, few realized the true scale of what was unfolding. The turning point came when Little met Texas Ranger James Holland. Instead of confronting Little aggressively, Holland took a different approach. He listened. He treated Little as a person rather than a monster. Slowly, methodically, Little began confessing, not to 1 or 2 murders, but dozens. Then came something no one expected. Little started drawing. Using pen and paper, he sketched portraits of women he claimed to have killed. These were not crude or random drawings. They were detailed, expressive, and often hauntingly specific. Hairstyles, facial features, expressions frozen in time. For investigators, these drawings became a roadmap into the past. As the sketches circulated among law enforcement agencies, something remarkable began to happen. Cold cases started reopening. Families recognized faces that had never appeared in official records. Detectives matched details from decades-old crime scenes to Little's descriptions. Bodies once labeled Jane Doe were identified. In some cases, victims who had vanished without explanation were finally connected to a crime. What made this extraordinary was timing. Many of these confessions were only verified years after Little gave them. Some were confirmed after his health deteriorated, and several cases were officially closed after his death in December 2020. In that sense, the full truth didn't emerge until Samuel Little was gone. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually concluded that Little was responsible for at least 60 murders, making him the most prolific known serial killer in U.S. history. Investigators believe the true number may be even higher, but numbers don't tell the real story. The real story lies in what those posthumous confirmations meant for the families. For decades, many relatives had lived in limbo. Some were told their loved one likely ran away. Others were informed there wasn't enough evidence to pursue a case. In some heartbreaking instances, no one had even known a crime occurred. Then, years later, sometimes after parents had passed away, after siblings had grown old, answers finally came. A confession made in prison. A drawing found in a file. A match confirmed long after the man who confessed was buried. This is why investigators describe Samuel Little's legacy as uniquely disturbing. Not just because of the number of victims, but because justice arrived so late. Closure came from beyond the grave, not in a mystical sense, but through evidence that outlived the killer himself. There's an uncomfortable lesson here. Little didn't get away with murder because he was brilliant. He succeeded because his victims were overlooked. Their disappearances weren't treated with urgency. Their lives weren't valued equally by the system meant to protect them. In interviews before his death, Little admitted this openly. He chose victims he believed no one would search for. That belief, tragically, proved accurate for far too long. Yet in the end, his attempt to erase these women failed. Through persistence, cross-agency collaboration, and the willingness of investigators to revisit old cases, many victims were finally named. Their deaths were acknowledged. Their stories were recorded. In several jurisdictions, cases that had been inactive for over 30 years were officially closed between 2020 and 2023, years after Little's voice had gone silent. That is what makes this story so unsettling. The confessions existed while he was alive, but understanding them, confirming them, took longer than his lifetime. The truth didn't fully surface until after he was gone. For law enforcement, this case changed how cold cases are approached. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, re-examining assumptions, and never dismissing a victim because of their lifestyle or background. For families, it was a painful kind of closure, but closure nonetheless. And for the rest of us, it serves as a sobering reminder: silence doesn't mean innocence, and time doesn't erase truth. Stories like this don't just come from the past, they shape how justice is pursued today. Every cold case reopened, every victim finally named, is a reminder that truth has a way of resurfacing, even decades later. If you believe these stories deserve to be told accurately, respectfully, and without sensationalism, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like this video if it kept you engaged, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into real cases that changed history. Because sometimes, the most important confessions aren't heard in a courtroom. They're heard long after the voice that spoke them is gone.